everyone, thanks so much for coming to the event today, or just watching the videos on YouTube. I'm going to be talking to you about LGBTQ+ editing on Wikipedia. Specifically, I'm going to be focusing on the idea of queering Wikipedia and making sure pages are representative and trying to push back on queer LGBTQ+ erasure. So a bit of a background about me. I'm a Roman archaeologist specialising in gender and sex, decolonising and reception. I also work as a trans-inclusive workplace consultant, mostly in universities, which has fed my interest in reception. Most of my Wikipedia editing is of past people. I know WCC Wiki does past people and present people, but I focus more on past people. I adjust pages to be more accurately represent their gender and sexuality, basically. I mostly edit to correct pages of transgender and gender non-conforming people, so this talk will mostly concentrate on that because I think that's what I know the most about. This was originally meant to be a panel discussion so we could get lots of different viewpoints on this, but it didn't work out that way because everyone's busy. So you'll just get my viewpoint from this, but then hopefully we can get some discussion in the questions later. So I want to look first at just a quick overview of LGBTQ+ history and classics and the general heritage field. LGBTQ+ identities aren't new. The history books almost never venture much outside of the 20th century. And of course there are exceptions, but they usually concentrate on gay men, sex and relationships, or sapphic woman's sex. And this is left to a mistrust of us as just past experts. And here I've got a common LGBTQ+ meme, which is sort of taking examples of historians finding some archaeology or finding some evidence in writing and just saying that, oh, they were best friends. So here we have this one. It says Achilles and Patroclus have their ashes mixed together so they'll never be apart in death, and historians just say, what's better than this, just guys being dudes. So it's like a very common format that really presents the mistrust of our industry by LGBTQ+ people. And although these memes sort of more present a distrust of academic and experts of heritage and history, it's not something that wiki editors are innocent of, even if they're not themselves academics, because we get our info from academic sources and news websites primarily, which also perpetuate uninclusive views often. These sources are, like I say, rife with queer erasure. So when we write our pages, they're based on a foundation of something that's already erasing these people. So if cis and straight wiki editors want to write LGBTQ+ inclusive pages, they need to know what to look out for in their sources, because LGBTQ+ people sort of, we can sense ourselves, and it's much easier for us to tell when something has been erased or something has been left out, because you know, it's just part of our lives that we see are missing, whereas straight and cis people don't automatically find this. So another big problem is sort of online harassment groups dedicated to harassing a person and leading to edit wars. So Wikipedia is used by Q-phobic, by which I mean like homophobic, transphobic, etc. groups as an easy, consequence-free way of harassing LGBTQ+ people who are famous or renowned, as well as a way to further their agenda. So while these kind of edits get sorted out quite quickly, they can end up in like an edit war where someone changes it back to what's correct, and then the harassers will change it back to what they want, and that happens over and over again until someone can protect the page, and obviously the protect notices still don't last forever. So I just brought up this example here of the Wikipedia page for Harry Allen, who's a trans man who lived in the 1800s, early 1900s, and it's quite easy to spot these edit wars if you just go into the view history of the page. Yeah, so we can see there's lots of changing and changing back, and a lot of edits from accounts that have now been deleted. Particularly in this one, they're changing to remove the dead name of this person, so the birth name of Harry Allen, and that's most of what it is. It's just people changing it, remove dead name, and then saying contemporaneous coverage of Allen used this name, back and forth, basically. And while obviously this is much less of a problem when it's not a living person because they're not getting this hurt from it, it's still like active targeting of trans people in general, or queer people in general, depending on what the page is. So coming on to the more helpful bit, the solutions and good practice. So first of all, I wanted to go over some tips for writing about LGBTQ+ people in a respectful way. This is particularly useful for Wikipedia pages, but also it's just general good advice. So firstly, consistently use correct gendered language. So don't talk about a person using language that they wouldn't use for themselves. Don't use incorrect pronouns for someone if you're talking about like the past of their life where they were living as the other gender or a different gender. Just use the same language as they'd use now, or they would have used when they were after they transitioned. So I don't know, to give an example, say there was a person who is a woman and they transitioned in their 30s, but they were notable beforehand as living as a man before they transitioned. When you were writing about that period before the transition, you wouldn't use he, him pronouns. You would still use she, her for the whole life. And somewhere in the article, it would probably be noted that this person transitioned at age 30 because they were notable before that, but you'd still use the consistent she, her pronouns throughout. Additionally, if they weren't notable before they transitioned, it's almost not worth mentioning unless their career is specifically related to being transgender, or being gay or bisexual or whatever. Again, a very similar point, but don't refer to their dead name, which is the name that they were given at birth before they changed their name, unless they were notable under that name. Of course, if they were notable under that name, it doesn't need to be mentioned loads and loads because you are going to be using that consistent language throughout the article. But in the info panel under other names, you would put that old name that they don't use anymore only if they were notable under that name and they were publishing or had credits under that name. Don't use phrases like used to be a man or used to be a woman or identifies as X. So obviously you can say, if it's like unclear what their gender identity is because they're like an ancient person, you can be like, it's unsure if this person identified as a woman or a man, but you wouldn't say so-and-so is a classicist from the 1800s who identified as a man. You would say a male classicist. Saying identified as X when it's clear exactly what their identity is just sort of brings to the fore like a doubt that they're being truthful about their identity, which is something that trans people really struggle with currently. And then finally, avoid outdated language unless it's specifically related to that person, i.e. it's something that they would have used to refer to themselves, or it's something that they're like frequently acceptably used. So if it's like a person from 200 years ago and everyone is using the word transvestite to discuss them, it's more acceptable to use that because they probably would have used that word themselves. But you wouldn't use that about a present trans person unless they particularly identified with that word. So when you see a wiki page that for an LGBTQ+ person and you see one of these sort of breaking these writing tips and potentially not being respectful, don't just look at it and assume that it's just an outlier or, that's how that person would have wanted it. Because obviously there are always exceptions, but really you should, if you're unsure and it doesn't look right, you should do your research and check and fix it if it is in fact wrong. Because assuming everything is fine is how the majority of the load gets put on LGBTQ+ people, who also have to deal with the emotional pain of seeing people like them disrespected. Because it's easy for cis and straight people to be like, well, I don't know, this isn't really a thing I know about, I don't know if this is incorrect or what, so I'm just going to move on. But obviously that leaves a lot of work for LGBTQ+ people. And especially if LGBTQ+ academics or non-academics are saying a person was LGBTQ+, then you should listen to them and include that in the writing. If it's like a common idea that a particular person was gay, for example, it's worth therefore even including in the Wikipedia article saying it's a common conception that this person was gay, even if you can't find any evidence that's like solidly confirming or denying that. The second thing I want to go over is how to avoid these editing wars. Obviously sometimes they just happen because people are just committed to this sort of harassment, but there's this idea of compromise without disrespecting the person. So often you'll feel like you have to compromise to get the edit to stick, but this compromise doesn't mean disrespecting the person through misgendering them or erasure of queerness or anything like that, but instead representing these things in a way that clearly follows the wiki rules. So, for example, including a dead name even if they were notable by it, which is what happened in the Harry Allen example we had. He is now gendered correctly and named correctly throughout the article, but in the info section under other names there's this dead name because it's been accepted that he was notable under that name. Saying it is generally accepted that person was in relationship with X or preferred not to be referred to as X. So if it's not 100% clear, even if to you it's very obvious that this person was probably gay or transgender, when there's not any like concrete evidence, it's easy to just put this. It is generally accepted that, or it's many people have discussed that this, because that's still notable about that person, right? Using gender neutral language for people where it's unclear what they would have preferred, even if you're sure that it was X or Y. So an example is I edited a page for Herculean Barban, who for almost all of her life used she/her pronouns, and when I personally write about her, I use she/her pronouns. But in the last year of her life, she was forced to live as a man because she was intersex, and a doctor decided that actually her sex presentation was more suited to maleness. So a lot of writing about her uses he/him pronouns, but she would have only used those for like a year. So as a compromise, because she had actually, used both pronouns to refer to herself, I put they/them pronouns on the page to make sure that I wasn't going to end in this edit war where people would change. I put she and they'd be like, oh, but when he died, he was a he, etc. So changing it to this gender neutral language has sort of concretely set that edit, and it's more representative and less upsetting to intersex people who might be looking up this icon, for example. So this is less of a solution point, more of a best practice point, where I just wanted to touch upon the problems with writing about past people in terms of gender and sexuality. Because obviously in a reception sense, we can project our experiences onto the past, as the death of the author is here literal. And that's obviously very important to queer people, to help a feeling of like ancestry and role models, etc. But it's also to consider that these experiences were not ours, and we're trying to write accurate, respectful representations of these people via these Wikipedia pages. So we can't assume that their understandings of gender and sexuality were the same as ours, because modern cultures have different ideas of gender that don't make sense to outsiders, for example, and it would be racist of us to apply a Western idea of gender to them. And in the same way, we should treat the past, because again, they're different cultures that we are not a part of. So we need to consider whether or not something was really gay in the ancient world when they didn't have this strict concept of binary sexuality. So last thing, just outside of Wikipedia, things you can do as well to make everything more respectful to LGBTQ plus people in academia, and this will ripple through to Wikipedia as well, is educate yourself. Don't rely on people to tell you all the time when you're doing something wrong. Try and find out for yourself what best practice is, obviously by going to talks like this, but also if you have like the ability to bring inclusivity training to your workplace, I would very much recommend doing so. Nothing about us without us, so if you're going to do any LGBTQ plus research, you should be including those people in your research. The same goes for any marginalised identity. Talk to marginalised communities about archaeology and heritage and ask how we can get them in and involve them more in the process. And start reanalyzing everything. Don't assume that previous research is sound when we actually know that previous research has been erasing LGBTQ plus people.